The dark quarter of the city, engulfed in the shadows of night, seems silent as always. The streets are empty, with few exceptions, only sparse streetlights illuminate the ominous shadows that seem to move according to their own laws. Here, in this sullen-looking place, on the edge of the ordinary world, people often hide, as if afraid of something that remains invisible to the eyes of ordinary passers-by. But today, something is different. A black girl in a wheelchair rolls slowly down the narrow sidewalk, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. She is in no hurry, her hands barely touching the wheels, and a veil of determination covers her face. These streets were her home, and she was used to these grim surroundings. But today is different than always. Up ahead, at the end of a dark alley, a silhouette appears. A policeman. His face is hidden in the darkness, but his figure stands out clearly against the lifeless street. Tall, with a backpack, standing directly in the girl's path. When his gaze meets hers, something changes in the air. He freezes for a moment, and then his lips curve into a sarcastic smile. The girl feels the tension in the air. Her heart beats faster and her hands clutch the rim of the wheelchair. She realizes that something is not right here. This policeman, who should be on her side, suddenly seems hostile, as if she were not a person but an object for his annoyance. "Where are you going, girl?" His voice sounds too loud for such a dark night. It's not just a question, it's an accusation. He takes a step forward, his shadow growing, engulfing her. "Walk on by," the girl replies faintly, but her words sound like a faint protest. She knows she can't run away, that her place here is in a wheelchair. She knows that this policeman doesn't even seem like he's going to listen to her. He steps even closer, and now his face can be seen. His eyes are cold and empty, like abysses. It's as if he doesn't see the person in front of him, only an object to be manipulated. He looks at her as if her existence is just part of his game. What, too lazy to get up and walk? He laughs, and the laughter seems loud and angry in this quiet neighborhood. The girl flinches at his words, but she holds on. Her heart pounds frantically in her chest, but she shows no fear. The policeman leans over and clutches the wheelchair in his hands as if she were a toy. He doesn't see the pain her body is in. He doesn't realize the sheer force of will behind her every movement. He doesn't notice that her life is a constant struggle with herself. The girl clenches her teeth, but doesn't answer. She just stares at him, keeping herself from crying. She knows that no one will come to help. But she didn't know one thing: around the corner, in the shadows, her father is watching, and this will be the moment that changes everything. The policeman with a smile on his face turns the wheelchair sharply and pulls it forcefully to the side. The wheels squeak. He brakes it without thinking of the consequences. Here, in this dark night, something terrible is happening. And this encounter is no accident. The policeman stood there, as if he had decided that he was in charge. His gaze was hard as stone, his steps sure and commanding. He leaned toward the girl again, his eyes glittering in the dark night, ready to tear through any obstacle that came his way. He didn't even notice that there was a person in front of him, not just the object of his anger. The girl sat in her wheelchair, her hands clenched around the rim, trying to hide her weakness, but inside her a storm of fear was rising. "Stand up," growled the policeman. He expected no objection, his voice was full of contempt, as if he were ordering not a living creature but a thing. "Stand up," I said. The girl couldn't understand what was happening. Her heart beat faster and faster with each word, but her body could not obey. She was tied to a wheelchair, her legs had no strength to get up. She tried to answer, but her voice was quiet, almost a breakdown. "I can't." "What did you say?" The policeman leaned even closer, his face already close, and now it felt like it was about to take her breath away. He didn't hear her faint words, didn't try to understand. His focus was on one goal only: to break her, to make her weak and submissive. "Are you kidding me? Stand up." His voice sounded increasingly irritated. He grabbed the wheelchair by the rim and started pulling it toward him with force. The wheels creaked sharply, and the girl cried out fearfully, feeling her body shaking from the involuntary exertion. She tried to hold on, but she couldn't. How could she stand up if her legs wouldn't obey? "I can't," she said it again, not knowing how to get the truth to him. "What do you mean you can't?" The policeman, knowing no measure in his rage, gripped the stroller even tighter. "Are you too lazy an animal to get up?" She felt his words penetrate deeper than he could have imagined. Those words, full of contempt and racism, were burning her from the inside out. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She clenched her teeth, trying to contain herself. "Aren't you ashamed?" Her voice had gotten a little quieter, but there was still strength in it. "I can't get up. I'm disabled." "What, you think I'm here to pity people like you?" The policeman bellowed, and his eyes filled with unbearable rage. "Don't you dare teach me, girl. Stand up or I'll help you." She tried to push the wheelchair back, but her arms were too weak. There was not even a shadow of doubt in the policeman's eyes. He was sure it was just a manifestation of laziness. He pulled the wheelchair once more, guiding its wheels with force toward the sidewalk. She couldn't hold on, her body was too weak, and he didn't want to hear excuses. His brute force was leaving marks on her, as if she wasn't a person but only an object for his aggression. "Did you hear me, or do I need to tell you again?" He bellowed, pulling the wheelchair off the ground and pushing it as if it were a toy. The girl felt the wheels wrenching beneath her and tried desperately to hold on. But there was still an ineffable mixture of pain and humility in her eyes. Her heart beat as if it were trying to burst out of her chest. What did he want from her? Why all this? And at that moment, when all her strength was at its limit, when it seemed to her that there was no more possibility of surviving this horror, a figure appeared on the horizon, almost imperceptibly. Father. He stands in the shadows like a ghost, watching the scene, unable to believe what is happening. His hands are clenched into fists, and his face expresses deep shock mixed with rage. He couldn't even imagine his daughter going through such agony, but he knew one thing: this encounter would not be without consequences. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from and whether there was something similar in your life. We're very interested to hear what you think. If you like what we do, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now we continue. The policeman never took his eyes off the girl, as if he wanted to make her feel his every insulting glance. His hand still clutched the wheelchair, and the wheels squeaked with pressure, as a foretaste that he was ready to do anything to her. His face became even more cruel and his eyes filled with unbearable anger, as if all his rage was directed at this helpless girl. You can't even stand up. Do you feel sorry for yourself? His voice grew louder and louder, losing all human edge with each word. Maybe you're just expecting someone to feel sorry for you. You're black, you're handicapped, so sit in your wheelchair and don't make a move. You don't deserve anything else. Her heart could barely stand the torrent of foul words. Every word he said, every insult, penetrated her like a knife. She tried to swallow, but there was a weight in her chest that she couldn't shake off. He was humiliating her not only as a person, but also as a person, and his rage was becoming more and more unrestrained. His words, full of racism and contempt, began to fill the air like a fog she couldn't dispel. I know what you're thinking, don't I? The policeman continued, leaning even closer, his breath hot and unpleasant. You're hoping someone will save you, but you're wrong. No one's coming. You have nowhere to hide. You can't run away, you're just an object for pity. Even your disabled status won't help you. Her eyes filled with tears, but she wouldn't let herself cry. She couldn't show weakness, or this man would break her as he would break any toy. She pressed her lips together and looked into his eyes, not pleading, not surrendering, but with some inner resistance. That's not how it works, she said quietly but confidently. I'm not looking for pity, I don't want you to pity me. The policeman laughed, his laugh was low, hoarse, filled with contempt. You don't want pity? Then you should stand up and show me what you can do. He bombarded her with new words, accusing her of weakness and inaction, but they were just as meaningless as his previous ones. At that moment, the girl felt her world shrinking, as if the air were squeezing her from all sides. She was trapped between his aggression and her physical weakness. She could not resist his words, because each of them penetrated her soul, leaving painful traces in her heart. But suddenly, in the darkest moments of the encounter, as the policeman continued to advance, as his words became more and more angry and scalding, somewhere in the back of her mind something awoke. It was not fear, it was a response not of a victim, but of a fighter. You don't know me, she said, and this time her voice sounded firm despite the trembling in her body. You don't know what I'm going through. You don't know how hard it is to be in my skin. The policeman was silent for a moment. It wasn't a surrender, it was a challenge. He looked at her, and a spark flashed in his gaze, as if he suddenly realized that this girl was not as simple as he had thought. But his rage was great, and he couldn't stop. Shut up! He shrieked, shoving the wheelchair forward sharply so that the girl was back on the edge of the sidewalk. Don't you dare say such things to me. You're not even worthy of my anger. At that moment, the air became so heavy you could almost touch it. But the girl did not lower her eyes, despite his anger. She could have fallen, could have turned around and told him she lacked strength, but she stood, as if her body summoned a strength she herself had not expected. There was a spark of determination in her eyes, and that look was an answer to everything he said. On the corner, just a few meters away from the scene of what was happening, there were several people standing frozen in the shadows. Their eyes followed the policeman and the girl in the wheelchair, but they did not move, did not take a step forward. There was an air of fear in the air, and each of them knew that any interference in this moment could turn into an even greater threat. People watched with bated breath, trying to figure out what to do, and at the same time they were afraid to make even a movement. One man, an old man with a hooded beard, stood in the shade of a tree clutching his bag. His hands were trembling slightly, and he could not take his eyes off the policeman who was bullying the girl more and more. The old man realized that interference could be dangerous, that this policeman could turn his aggression on someone else, and that the situation was about to get out of control. He barely heard the words the policeman was throwing in the girl's face, but he understood enough. Everything inside him was protesting against what was happening before his eyes. But he couldn't make a move. The woman standing a little farther away, with a small child by her arm, pressed her lips together and turned away. She felt her heart failing with anger and shame, but her body was paralyzed. She didn't want to risk it, she was afraid that if she made a move, she would become another victim of this town where everything could turn against her. But there was one person who could no longer keep silent, although he too was afraid. A young guy, probably a student, with shaky hands pulled out his phone and started quietly filming what was happening. He stood a little farther away, clutching the camera in his hands, and he knew, what he was seeing was something that could not go unnoticed. His face was pale, and his breathing was heavy. He realized he was filming horror, but he couldn't take his eyes off the screen. He filmed every movement of the policeman, every word he uttered. You think I'm going to feel sorry for you because you're handicapped? The policeman's words continued to echo in the night air like gunshots. Each one was a canvas of insult, wiping everything human out of the girl. She tried not to give up, clenched her teeth and held on as best she could. But there was a moment in her eyes when the pain and humiliation began to overpower everything else. She couldn't avoid his words, couldn't turn away from his anger. Black, handicapped, you shouldn't have been born at all, the cop continued his humiliation, pointing out her race and physical weakness. What are you even doing here, huh? Who gave you the right to live among normal people? The words, like icy needles, went straight to the girl's heart. She couldn't hide from them. Every muscle in her body tensed with pain, but she pressed her lips together, trying to hold on to her dignity. Meanwhile, the guy with the phone kept filming. He knew that this footage could be important, that it would be proof of everything that was happening. He could have stopped it, said something, intervened, but fear gripped him. He knew that if he came any closer, if he spoke, the policeman might turn on him, and it would end tragically. Instead, he stood in the shadows, continuing to take notes. Unconsciously, he was part of this terrible picture. And yet, it was something his conscience couldn't ignore. The man with the beard and the woman with the child looked on and remained silent. Each knew that they could have intervened, but they feared for their lives. They were invisible spectators of this scene, like all the others who were hiding in the shadows, unwilling but realizing that there was nothing they could do to help. The girl did not hear those footsteps, did not see those glances. She heard only the insults, felt only the weight of the attack. She was like a closed door into which the policeman was hammering his words, not realizing that she was not the object of his anger, but a human being, with dignity and the right to respect. But his eyes saw only race, only disability, only her weakness. Meanwhile, the guy had finished filming, and his eyes filled with anxiety. He knew that this videotape could be his last chance for justice, but what would he do with it if this nightmare went beyond the night? The shadowy figures continued to watch, silent and impassive, as the policeman broke not only the wheelchair but also the last vestiges of the girl's human dignity. The policeman stood in front of the girl like a monster, seized by an unbearable rage. His hands shook with rage, but his face remained cold, ruthless. He continued to curse her, to accuse her of not being worthy of anything this world had to offer her. His voice was low, muffled, but every word he spoke sounded like a blow. "You don't realize how lucky you are that I haven't broken your damn wheelchair yet." He bellowed, as if those words would make her feel even more humiliated. The girl tried to hide the trembling in her body by clenching her teeth, but her eyes could no longer hide the fear that had been with her from the beginning. Her hands were white with tension, and her heart was pounding frantically as if it were trying to break free. Every move the policeman made, every word he said stirred a storm of emotion in her, but there was one thing: she couldn't get up. She couldn't run away. The policeman came even closer and, as if deciding that her patience was worth testing, grabbed the wheelchair with force. She could barely hold on to it, feeling the wheels pulling out from under her. He didn't notice her screams, didn't notice her pain. He didn't hear her lips clench and her eyes fill with tears. With each movement, the policeman lost more and more control. His face contorted with rage, and his hands gripped the wheelchair so tightly that the metal rims creaked pitifully, and the girl felt her joints begin to break from the strain. "You'll have no excuses," he continued, not caring that his words hurt her. "You're nothing. You're trash." Then, without warning, he plowed the wheelchair to the ground with fury. The wheels slipped, and the girl was thrown onto the cold asphalt with a desperate cry. At that moment, the whole world around seemed to freeze. Everyone who stood in the shadows, who was silent and afraid, held their breath. The sound was horrible, like something expensive, something important, breaking. But that wasn't enough for the policeman. He picked up the wheelchair as if it were a toy and threw it aside with fury, tearing it away from the girl. At that moment, everything around him fell silent. It was as if a dark shadow had cast over the world, and everyone witnessed what was happening. It wasn't just an act of violence, it was a display of humiliation, a deep hatred, a hatred that had no cause. The girl lying on the cold asphalt tried to get up, but her body wouldn't listen. Her eyes were clouded with tears, but she tried to get up, to hold on to some part of herself, some bit of her dignity. But the policeman stood over her, not giving her a chance to get up, not giving her a chance to recover. "Do you see what's happening?" he uttered, his voice filled with contempt and malice. "You are not a human being. You're just an invalid who lives only because of the mercy of others." At that moment there was a strange silence in the air, as if everything around them had frozen, holding its breath. And although the policeman thought he had broken her, he did not know that deep inside, the girl remained whole. He didn't know that in that moment her eyes were full of not only pain, but determination. Yes, her wheelchair was destroyed, her body was on the verge, but her spirit was alive. In that moment, when the whole world seemed consumed by this horror and every onlooker lurking in the shadows was clenched in fear, there was something that made the girl's heart keep beating. She wouldn't give up, and even if that policeman tried to break her, he didn't know that the true strength of her soul wasn't dependent on the wheelchair or what was happening to her. This scene didn't end with the destruction of the wheelchair. It was just beginning. At the other end of the block, far from where the tragedy unfolded, the girl's father was walking slowly home. He was tired after a long day at work, his shoulders slumped, and his thoughts slipped smoothly into everyday worries. But something strange in the air made him stop. It was not a physical pain, but something deeper that was felt in his chest. He felt a strange uneasiness that grew stronger with each step. His eyes tried to run down the street, but nothing out of the ordinary could be seen. However, the anxiety was not going away. He slowed his step, stopped, looked around. There was a strange feeling that his daughter was threatened by something, but he couldn't figure out where that fear came from. The girl wasn't around and he couldn't find her. This wasn't the way it usually happened. He always felt her presence, even if she was far away, but today something was wrong. He began to quicken his steps, his heart beating faster. Suddenly, a sound came from the shadows that made him freeze in place. The sound came from the direction where his daughter should have been. He heard a scream, quiet, but full of pain and fear. The father felt his body instantly tense up. It wasn't just frightened excitement, it was a foreboding pain he could no longer fight. He turned around, as if on instinct, and rushed in the direction where the policeman had just been. On the way he noticed several people whispering among themselves, but no one dared to interfere. Everyone looked in his direction with blank eyes, realizing that if they could do anything, they would have done it already. His steps grew faster and faster as his eyes finally met what was happening in front of him. The picture was horrible, and it took him a few seconds to realize what was happening. The policeman stood clutching the wheelchair, tossing it around like a toy. The girl, beaten and helpless, lay on the pavement, her eyes full of fear and tears. And despite her situation, she was still trying to find the strength to get up. Everything around her seemed unreal, like a frame from a nightmare, and the father felt his soul shrink in an instant. "Are you crazy?" His voice sounded like a roar, full of terror and rage. He lunged forward as if he didn't realize how he was in this moment. There was no fear in his eyes, there was only a desire to protect his daughter, to give her back the safety she deserved. The policeman froze when he saw him, and something strange flashed in his eyes. He had not expected to see this man who happened to be nearby. He let go of the wheelchair, as if he was ready to continue this act of aggression. "What are you doing here, you bloody freak?" ranted the policeman, his voice low and menacing, like a wild animal's. "Are you going to protect this lowly invalid? She's nothing, she doesn't deserve your pity." The father felt his blood boiling with rage, and with every word the policeman said, his body clenched with the desire to avenge his daughter. But despite everything, his mind was a knife edge. He knew that only his control would help him now. He didn't know what was happening to the girl, how she survived all this horror, but he knew one thing: she was humiliated, she was broken, and that was unacceptable. "Don't you dare speak that way about my daughter." His words were almost a whisper, but there was such power with them that the air around him seemed to ignite. He stepped forward, ignoring his threats. The policeman laughed. That laugh was sinister, muffled, as if he had won, as if everything he was doing was perfectly justified. "You don't understand anything. Your tears won't help you, your daughter doesn't deserve your protection. She doesn't deserve your time or your pity. My father felt his whole life, all his pain, come rushing out." His eyes narrowed with anger. The power he had been holding back was bursting out like a storm. He stepped forward, each step he took full of pain, but also determination. He knew he wasn't just a father, he was a protector. And nothing could break that bond. The policeman was in front of him, but my father was ready for it. At that moment it seemed as if the whole world held its breath, and time slowed down, as if every next step could change everything. Let's take another quick pause. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from and whether you had something similar in your life. We want to know what you think. If you like what we're doing, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. And now we continue. Time seemed to slow down as the policeman stood in front of the girl's father. His breath was coming hard out of his chest, as if he were fighting an internal storm. His face was contorted and his gaze was blank, almost wild. His father stood before him, clenching his fists, and despite all his rage, he felt strangely uneasy. There was something more to this aggression than just anger at his daughter. Something that lurked deep within him. The policeman was not what he looked like on the outside. His brutality was not random, as it seemed at first. With every move he made, with every word he said, it became clear, this was no ordinary aggression. This was not mere physical force. It was rage, bursting from the darkest corners of his soul. You don't understand what it feels like. His voice was hoarse, almost unrecognizable. He looked at the girl's father, but it was as if his gaze was blank. You don't know what it's like to be weak. You don't know what it's like to be the one everyone hates, the one everyone thinks is nothing. It's impossible to be strong. Because the world doesn't allow it. My father stood there, unable to understand exactly what the policeman was trying to say. He saw something terrible in his eyes, something hidden, something that could explain his aggression, but at the same time it made his heart clench. He realized that there was more here than just a random act of violence. He had witnessed the pain that this man carried inside of him. But that pain didn't justify what he was doing. You don't know what it's like to be weak, the cop continued, his words now sounding like screams, as if they were bursting from the very depths of his traumatized mind. I was like that. I was the one everyone despised. The one who didn't have a chance, who was rejected. Everyone hated me. And now I'm becoming the one everyone fears. I break those who are weak. It became clear to the girl's father, this was not just cruelty, it was revenge. Revenge for the fact that the policeman had once felt like this girl, who, in his opinion, was weak, powerless, just as he had once been. There was no room for compassion in his soul, only rage that had been bubbling up for years. With every word he spoke, he revealed his soul, and there was nothing in it that could justify his actions. My father felt something heavy pressing against his chest. He could not understand how this man, who carried such pain, could allow himself to do this to others. His anger was not only against the girl, but against the whole world that had once wronged him. The policeman took a step forward, but his eyes were clouded, as if he couldn't see what was going on around him. He was consumed by his own demons. Everything he said sounded like the cry of a man who had lost touch with reality, with humanity. He was both aggressor and victim at the same time. And in his eyes you could see not only hatred, but also despair. I was nothing. I was pathetic. And now I can destroy anyone, the cop continued, his voice growing more desperate. You don't understand what that means. You don't know what it is to be the one no one sees, the one everyone neglects. I destroyed them, and now I'll destroy her. I will destroy everything she loves. The girl's father was shocked by what he heard. He saw before him not just an aggressor, not just a policeman, but a man who was living in the hell of his own past. He saw that this man was broken even before he started breaking others. But his pain didn't justify his actions. His demons couldn't be an excuse to hurt others. You can't get back what you've lost by destroying others, the girl's father said, his voice firm despite all the rage that raged in his chest. He glared at the policeman, who now looked like a man who had lost control. You won't get your peace of mind back by destroying other people. The policeman fell silent, his eyes growing wilder and wilder, but now there was a spark of doubt in them. He didn't seem to know how to react to these words. His hands trembled, and he took a step back, as if an inner conflict was tearing him apart. But then he remembered the girl again, and his face took on a fierce expression again. "You don't understand." The policeman shouted, his voice becoming aggressive again. "You don't know what it's like to be rejected by everyone around you." Father stepped forward, but now his hands were relaxed. He wasn't ready for violence, he was ready for dialogue, ready to show that even if this man was broken, he could choose a different path. "I understand more than you realize. But I won't let you break my daughter." The policeman stood confused, and this moment was the worst for him, the moment when he realized that his rage, his cruelty, could not undo what had been destroyed in his soul. Meanwhile, the girl lay on the pavement, her eyes merging with the darkness, but she was still conscious. Her father was here, and this was the moment that had changed their lives. The dark streets became even more ominous when the policeman, losing all measure, destroyed the wheelchair with force and fury. The wheels slipped, metal parts broke, and the girl, like a defenseless toy, found herself on the pavement, her body frantically trying to find footing. The air was filled with a deafening grinding that seemed to be not only a sound, but the embodiment of all the suffering she was experiencing. The policeman stood over her, oblivious to her helplessness, his breathing heavy and hoarse, as if he had just done something that should have brought him relief but in fact only deepened his rage. He couldn't see what was going on around him. He didn't see the world around him freeze in horror. However, amidst this chaos, amidst the destruction and pain, a man emerged from the shadows. He was invisible until that moment, as if he did not exist in this space, but his eyes were already on the policeman, and his gaze was on the girl. He was not just a spectator, he was part of this scene, part of this world, though he stood silently aside. The girl's father had been around the whole time, hidden from the cop's eyes, watching everything unfold. He stood around the corner, his body tense, but he didn't act. He didn't interfere. He knew that if he made even a move, it would be over much faster than he expected. He didn't want to rush things. He wasn't ready to stir up an even bigger storm. He saw everything, how the policeman screamed, how he broke the wheelchair, how the girl, shocked and helpless, tried to get up. He saw her face too, full of pain and fear, and he couldn't believe this was happening to him, to his daughter. He was paralyzed not only with horror, but with incredible rage. But there was not a single expression on his face, not a single movement. He was like a stone hidden in the shadows of the night. Father felt his heart pounding frantically in his chest. He felt the full weight of what was happening, as if his soul were splintering apart. He heard every sound, every word the policeman said, every movement she made, every angry reference he made. But in spite of that, he took his time. He waited. He knew he couldn't take it all back, but he could choose when to step into this moment. When the policeman turned to the girl again, his face expressed complete indifference. He was sure he had won. He thought he had smashed her, that he had broken her, that she would now mean nothing. He was so sure of his power that he didn't notice the shadow standing nearby ready to become a threat to him. But at the moment when the policeman was about to take another step with a sneer, when he was about to continue his insults, his father appeared from the shadows. His eyes glittered with fury and coldness. He stood without moving, but his presence was palpable in the air, like a storm cloud ready to burst. The policeman froze. A spark of concern flashed in his eyes, but he quickly suppressed it. He looked at the girl's father, and his face changed slightly. This man wasn't just a spectator, wasn't just someone to be ignored. That look, that coldness that came from him, awakened a deep insecurity in the policeman. The girl's father didn't move, but there was all the determination in the world in his eyes. He didn't look at the policeman with a threat, he didn't shout. He didn't show the slightest fear. He looked as if he knew that this moment was his moment, his only chance. The policeman looked him over, as if trying to figure out his weaknesses. He noticed that the man was calm, despite the fact that he stood before him as if in a battlefield. He was stout, but there was no fear in his eyes. It made him hesitate. "You think you can stop me?" uttered the policeman, but his voice was no longer so confident. "You're a nobody. There's nothing you can do to help." The girl's father said nothing. He stepped forward, his step measured but confident. He didn't try to argue, he didn't want to waste time with words. His presence was a threat to the policeman, and he knew it. Father's gaze was like an icy knife that pierced the atmosphere. There was a determination in his eyes that was unquestionable. He was willing to go all the way no matter what. He wasn't someone who was afraid. He was someone who was protecting his daughter. And in that moment, the policeman realized, he was standing in front of a man who was no longer someone to be humiliated. He was standing in front of someone who was willing to fight for his family, for his daughter, even if it meant confronting the system that protected him. The girl's father continued to stare at him, unblinking, never taking his eyes off him. His face expressed neither fear nor anger. It was cold as ice, but there was a strength in it. A strength the policeman could not understand. A power he had never known. At that moment, the father realized that the moment had come when he had to act. He was ready not only to protect his daughter, but also to restore justice that had been lost. A moment stretched like an echo before my father moved forward. His every movement was a decision, made at a moment when he could no longer remain silent. There was no fear or hesitation in his eyes. Only a deep determination that tore through the silence of the night. He was ready to go all the way, despite all the threats and consequences. The policeman stood in front of him, his gaze becoming wary. He could feel the air around him grow dense, tense. He saw his father take a step forward, but he hadn't expected him to decide to act so quickly. His reaction was slow, trying to process the situation in his head, to realize what was going on. But it was too late. In a flash, without giving the policeman time to react, my father rushed forward. His step was sure and heavy, like a warrior ready to defend his territory. He literally charged into the policeman, his body tight as a spring, hiding all the pain, all the humiliation he had endured, and all the love he had for his daughter. It was the moment when his feelings exploded in one decisive movement. His sacrificial love for his daughter was now turning into a force that he turned against the one who dared to humiliate her. The policeman had not expected such force. His eyes widened with surprise, and he was knocked off his feet. The strength hidden in his father's body was incredible. He knew that this moment was crucial, and he wasn't going to let this policeman break another person, especially his daughter. Fate collided with reality in that instant when the father and the policeman met in a collision. The air shook with the force of the impact, and the policeman flew aside, losing his balance. He tried to get up, but the father's body kept advancing like a hammer that carried justice with it. The policeman's body landed on the pavement with a thud. It wasn't just a collision of two bodies, it was a collision of two worlds, two worldviews. The policeman struggled to his feet, his breathing heavy and his eyes full of shock. He hadn't expected that someone could interrupt his aggression so quickly and decisively. He could feel his power and control beginning to melt like ice under the influence of fire. But that only added to his rage. "Are you out of your mind?" he shouted, wiping the blood from his lips. His face became contorted with pain and anger. "You think you can stop me?" The father didn't answer. He just stood there, his gaze fixed directly on the policeman, like the gaze of a beast ready to defend its life. There was not the slightest hesitation in his eyes. He was certain that this confrontation had become necessary. It was a moment that could not be missed. The policeman tried to attack again, but my father was faster. His movements were like a torrent of water, leaving the policeman no chance. He grabbed him by the pecs, lifted him up, and pushed him to the ground again with such force that the pavement echoed with a thud. Every step he took, every thrust he made, was filled with all the rage he was holding back, all the anger and helplessness he felt as he watched his daughter suffer. He could no longer stand by and watch his little girl become a victim of this world. The policeman shouted, trying to get up, but my father did not stop. He was ready to go all the way, and his gaze never left the policeman. He knew he had to be determined, he couldn't let him break free. Father was like an unrelenting storm that would sweep away everything in its path. You have no right to humiliate her. He shouted, his voice brimming with power and pain. You have no right to her life, you have no right to break her. The policeman tried to get up again, his body was bloody and sore, but he couldn't regain control. He didn't know what to do. He was trapped by his own anger, which now came crashing down on him in the form of a masculine force ready to stand to the end. With every step my father took, with every decisive movement he made, the policeman lost more and more of his dignity, his power. His face was contorted in horror and confusion, and his attempts to stand up, to resist, became more and more pathetic. You think you can do something to me? Shouted the policeman, but his voice sounded weak and lifeless. His body twitched weakly, but he could not stop this torrent of rage that was now directed only at him. This moment was decisive, the policeman was no longer in control of the situation. His father took the last step, standing over him, clenching his fists. He was ready to rip him out of this life, to tear him from this world of cruelty, but in that moment he felt his daughter's gaze, even if she was far away. He saw her suffering, and it made him stop. He didn't want to destroy this man. He wanted him to feel the pain, the humiliation his daughter had endured, but he didn't want to be a killer. He stood, ready to act, but his heart knew he had to stop. The silence after the collision was deafening. There was still a heavy atmosphere in the air, as if time had stood still and no one knew what would happen next. The policeman lying on the ground tried to pull himself together, but his movements were stiff and uncertain. He couldn't believe what had just happened. His strength and confidence, which he had thought invincible, was now gone. He lay there like a man who had lost everything he thought he had and didn't know how to move on. His father stood over him, his breathing heavy and intermittent, his chest heaving with rage and pain. He looked at the policeman with such a stare that he seemed to feel a coldness creeping into the deepest corners of his soul. But his father did not beat him again. He stood like a stone, on the verge of choosing what to do now, what to do. The girl was still lying on the ground, her face covered with tears and her body trembling with fear and pain. Her every look was full of despair, she couldn't believe that this nightmare was happening to her family. Her wheelchair was broken and she knew her life would never be the same again. She felt all the strength drain out of her and it seemed like she couldn't take the pressure. But she still looked up to her father, her savior, her hero, even if she couldn't understand what would happen next. Are you out of your mind? The policeman finally said, his voice full of confusion and fear. He slowly tried to get up, his body was still sore from the blow, but there was an emptiness inside him, as if all his aggression had disappeared in 1 second. He didn't know what to do next. This man, this father who had just hit him, had shattered everything he had ever known about his power. He felt his helplessness and loss of control, and that was the worst part. His father did not answer him. He didn't want to say anything more. There was only one thing in his eyes, protecting his daughter. He wasn't going to talk, wasn't going to make excuses or apologize. He only knew one thing, his daughter didn't deserve this humiliation. No one deserved to be broken the way she had been. He stood, ready to give up everything for her, even if it meant losing everything he had. Can you stand on your feet? His voice sounded calm, but there was so much determination in it that the policeman, despite his aggression, knew he couldn't win. He tried to get up, but his body gave in treacherously and he fell to the ground again. He was weak, and he knew it. The father slowly approached his daughter. He looked at her with such love and care that the girl's heart squeezed with gratitude and pain at the same time. She lifted her head and there was not only pain but hope in her eyes. She reached out to him as if her salvation was in his hands alone. Daddy, her voice was weak, barely audible. I can't. She couldn't finish because the words stuck in her throat. Her father bent down, took her hand and helped her stand, but her legs were weak. She couldn't stand without help, and he realized she needed him again. He gently picked her up, and in that moment their world became small and quiet, hidden from everything else, from this cruel reality. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he needed to be there for her now. "You're not alone, you're not alone, I'll be with you," he said with such firmness that even the policeman on the ground felt a cold alienation from the world. He knew that these were not just words. They were the truth, and that truth would follow him throughout his life. The policeman continued to lie on the pavement, his eyes closed and his face contorted with fear and pain. He did not know what would happen next. The strength was gone, and all that was left was emptiness. He hadn't expected that someday his own cruelty could turn on him the way it did here. He realized that his actions had led to one of the worst consequences of all, his own downfall. But the worst thing he realized was that he had destroyed his own life. Everything he had built over the years had crumbled in an instant. And it wasn't just a physical defeat. It was a moral defeat. He had become what he had hated for so long, weak, helpless and humiliated. And his helplessness was now his punishment. The father and daughter slowly walked away. He didn't look back at the policeman, he didn't want to look at him anymore. All he had to do was leave and get his daughter. But they knew they had a difficult road ahead of them. The unknown. Justice may have been done, but this moment was a turning point for both of them. His decision, to stand and fight for his daughter no matter what, was the strongest act of resistance anyone could make. As they disappeared into the night, the policeman was left lying on the ground, realizing that he would no longer be the man he used to be. He had lost everything. What do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your thoughts and opinions are very important to us and we value each and every one of you. Please don't forget to subscribe and give us a like if you enjoyed it, and support us in creating more stories. Write a phrase in the comments that reflects your reaction to the story so we know you listened to the end. We wish you a good day.